There are moments in life when someone's silence feels heavier than the loudest argument. It was the kind of silence that grows between two people, not because of words spoken, but because of the words that were never said. And for the first time in a long while, I felt truly alone with my own struggles. I had just lost my job. The cafe where I'd worked for almost 3 years had closed down unexpectedly.
No warning, no gradual transition.
One day, I was pouring coffee. The next, I was standing in my small kitchen, staring at the bills piling up on the table, trying to breathe through the panic weighing heavily on my chest. Rent was due at the end of the week, and my savings were barely enough, maybe just to cover groceries and gas if I was lucky. We weren't married, my boyfriend and I. We didn't even live together. That was his decision, not mine. He liked his space, said it was healthy to have boundaries. But after a few years of hearing that word, it started to feel like just another wall between us. And yet, despite the distance, despite how often I had to remind myself that we weren't building a life together, but simply orbiting each other's, I still called him first. I hadn't even finished 2 sentences before he interrupted me. "Well, you'll figure it out," he said, like I was mentioning the weather instead of explaining that I couldn't pay my rent. "You always do." I swallowed hard. "I just thought maybe you could help me this month." "I wouldn't." "Look," he sighed, and I could hear the tapping of his fingers against something, distracted. "It's not really my responsibility, is it?"
I mean, you're independent.
"You always say so." I wanted to cry out, not because he was wrong, but because he was using my own words against me. I was independent. I had always taken pride in that. But there's a difference between being independent and being left to handle everything. The call ended with one of those awkward pauses where neither of us really knew how to close the conversation. He mumbled something like, "Take care," before hanging up. I stood there for a long time after, phone still pressed to my ear even though the line had gone dead. The apartment felt colder that night, empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. I sat on the floor by the window, knees pulled tight to my chest, watching the streetlights blink on one by one. The city outside kept moving, as if my small collapse didn't matter at all. It was late when I heard the knock at the door. Not urgent.
Not impatient.
Just steady. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater and pulled myself off the floor. When I opened the door, there he was. My landlord. He was always polite, courteous in that way older men sometimes are, as though they know their presence carries weight. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark skin that caught the light and eyes that seemed to notice more than they let on. His voice was always calm, steady. He never raised it. "Sorry to bother you this late," he said, nodding once. "Just following up on the rent situation." The words made my stomach drop. I must have looked worn out, red eyes, messy hair, still in the oversized sweater I'd thrown on that morning because I couldn't bring myself to care. "I know the deadline's coming," I managed to say, my throat tight. I lost my job." There was a pause. Not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind where the other person is genuinely listening. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He just nodded again, slower this time. "That's tough," he said. "I'm sorry to hear it."
I could feel the heat rise up my neck.
Embarrassment burning through me. I hated how small I felt, how obvious my situation must have seemed. "I'll figure it out," I blurted. I need a little time." His gaze He didn't cross his arms or lean against the doorframe like some men do when they're about to be stern. He just stood there, grounded, steady. "I'm not here to pressure you," he said softly, "but if you need to talk about options, my office is open. Come by tomorrow if you'd like." Options. The word echoed in my mind long after he left. I didn't know exactly what he meant. I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out. But when the door closed behind him and I slid back down onto the floor, burying my face into my hands, one thought pressed itself into my mind and refused to leave. I couldn't rely on the person I loved. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as independent as I'd always believed. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence like a steady, patient metronome. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his voice again. Not my landlord's, but my boyfriend's. Those few simple words so casually thrown at me, clanging like loose change in an empty jar. You'll figure it out. As if that was enough. As if that was what support sounded like. By morning, the ache in my chest had settled into something colder, sharper. I moved through the motions of the day because I had to, not because I wanted to. Took a shower without feeling the water. Got dressed without caring much what I put on.
Jean, en t-shirt.
Hair pulled back loosely, barely touched with a brush. I looked tired and the mirror didn't lie. The notice on my fridge about the rent deadline stared at me like a quiet threat. I hated that it made my hands tremble when I looked at it. Hated that the thought of calling my boyfriend again to ask for help felt so impossible, so humiliating. But most of all, I hated the sinking feeling that the conversation wouldn't go any differently than it had the night before. I didn't plan to go to my landlord's office. I told myself. He nodded slowly, still watching me with that same quiet focus, no judgment in his expression, just listening. I appreciate you being honest with me, he said after a moment. Most people don't even do that. There was another pause between us, the kind that stretched long enough to feel heavy but not uncomfortable, more like he was giving me space to say more if I wanted to. I've been looking for work, I added quickly, my voice a little too defensive. I'm not just sitting around waiting for help. I didn't assume you were, he answered gently. I could feel the heat creeping up the back of my neck again, a familiar wave of shame that I couldn't quite keep down. I hated being here like this, hated needing help at all. I don't expect you to give me a free pass, I said, struggling to keep my tone steady. I know that's not how this works. He didn't argue. He didn't make me feel worse than I already did. Instead, he leaned forward just slightly, folding his hands together on the desk between us. What if we discussed some alternatives? He asked, voice soft. I blinked, unsure what he meant. The words hung there, not suggestive, not loaded, just open. But there was something in the way he said them, careful, respectful. I'm listening, I replied, though I could already feel the tension start to build inside my chest. He didn't say anything at first. He just held my gaze. Calm, steady, but with that hint of sincerity. The kind that waits, that lets you fill the space yourself. There's no pressure, he said finally. I'm not asking for anything uncomfortable, but we can find a temporary solution, something manageable, until you're back on your feet. The room felt smaller all of a sudden, the air thicker. His words weren't forceful, and they carried no hidden meaning. But I understood the seriousness perfectly. I didn't speak right away. My mind was racing too fast, trying to make sense of everything. You mean? I started, but my voice caught before I could finish. He nodded once, slowly. Only if it's something you're comfortable with, he said. If not, the door's still open. You have my word. I sat there frozen for what felt like forever, heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. I should have gotten up.
You should have walked out.
But I didn't. I stayed. And when I finally did stand, my legs felt unsteady beneath me. I moved toward the door, but before I reached it, I stopped, my hand on the frame. I turned to look at him one last time, unsure of what I was searching for in his expression. But all I saw was that same calm, steady patience. The space he was giving me to make my own decision. I left without saying anything else, but my body was still humming from the weight of that conversation, and deep down I knew I would be back. The air outside felt colder than it should have for that time of year. Or maybe it was just me, walking home with my thoughts too loud to notice anything else. The streets blurred around me, cars passing by, people living their lives. None of it seemed real. I wasn't even sure how I made it back to my apartment. I unlocked the door mechanically, dropped my keys onto the counter, and stood there in the middle of the room like I didn't recognize the place. It's a strange thing, the way a single conversation can shift the entire shape of your mind. I kept going over it, again and again, hearing his voice, feeling the impact of his words settle into my chest. Maybe we could find another way to work this out.
No signe forceful, no signe inconfortable. Just inquiet, deliberate possibility.
I told myself that I should feel upset. I told myself I should feel cautious, wary, guarded. But the truth that I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried, was that I didn't feel any of those. I felt acknowledged, and I struggled with that. The hardest part wasn't the offer itself. The hardest part was how easily I could imagine accepting it. I spent the next 2 days avoiding my phone like it might bite me. I didn't call my boyfriend. He didn't call me either. There was no sudden concern from him, no check-in, no follow-up to the conversation we'd had that night. He'd already moved on. I was sure of it. Back to his schedule, his meetings, his world where I was just a background piece he could forget when things got complicated. And yet, there was a small part of me, the hopeful part, that waited for him to call anyway. Some flicker of belief that he might surprise me, might care enough to show up. But the silence from him was louder than any words. By the 3rd day, the rent deadline was staring me down like an unmovable wall. The number circled in red on my calendar felt childish now, as if highlighting it would somehow make it less real. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at it, knowing exactly how little was sitting in my bank account. I wasn't the kind of person who asked for help easily. I'd built my whole life around the idea that I didn't need to. And yet, here I was, cornered by circumstances, my pride clinging to me like wet clothes I couldn't shake off. I almost didn't send the message. My thumb hovered over the keyboard for a long time. I typed out 6 drafts, deleting each one before my nerves could get the better of me. When I finally hit send, the text was so short it barely hinted at the turmoil behind it.
Can we talk again?
He responded quickly.
Just 2 words, simple and clear.
Come by. I read those words over and over, each time feeling a different wave of nervousness and hope wash through me. The sun was starting to set when I finally left my apartment. The walk to his office felt longer than it had the first time. Every step felt like I was walking towards something uncertain, but when I pushed the door open, the room was quiet.
The same soft music humid from the radio.
He was at his desk again, leaning back in his chair like he'd been waiting all along. He didn't stand when I entered, didn't greet me with any exaggerated enthusiasm, just nodded toward the chair across from him, the same way he had before. I sat down slowly, unsure how to even begin. I'm not here to make this difficult, he said, breaking the silence after a long pause. If you changed your mind, I understand. I swallowed hard. My hands were clasped tightly in my lap, fingers twisting together until the knuckles ached. I could barely look at him. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk, hands folded. His expression stayed calm, open, giving me room to say whatever I needed to. I'm not going to ask you for details you're not ready to share, he said softly, but I'll tell you this. I respect the fact that you came. Whatever you decide, I'll respect that too. His words landed differently than I expected. There was no rush, no pressure behind them.
Juste patience.
I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to meet his gaze. I need time, I said finally. You have it, he replied. It should have felt like the end of the conversation, but I didn't move. Neither did he. The space between us held something unspoken, a quiet understanding neither of us felt the need to define. I didn't think it would ever come to this, I murmured, not even sure if I was talking to him or to myself. Most people don't, he said. I noticed how steady his voice was, how measured, like he had seen situations like this before, like he understood it in a way I hadn't expected. There was a long pause, heavy, but not uncomfortable. I could feel his eyes on me, but not in a way that made me uneasy. If anything, it felt like he actually saw me for who I was in that moment. Not just someone struggling with bills, but a tired, worn-out person trying hard to keep things together. I stood up slowly, my hands still shaking more than I wanted them to. I'll let you know, I said. He nodded once, saying nothing more, letting me have the last word without argument. But as I turned to leave, I felt his eyes follow me to the door. And for the first time, I didn't mind the way it felt. I didn't feel uncomfortable, I just felt noticed. I thought walking away from that conversation would bring me clarity, some sense of relief for holding my ground, for not immediately agreeing to anything I wasn't sure about. But clarity didn't come. What came instead was a weight in my chest that only grew heavier with each hour that passed. I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head, every word, every look, every pause between us. The truth was that I had already crossed an internal line the moment I didn't shut the door on the idea of finding another. I spent the next few days trying to distract myself with anything I could find. I filled out job applications like it was my new full-time job, scrolling endlessly through listings that all started to blur together. Waitressing, reception work, retail, anything that could buy me a little time. But when responses came at all, they were polite rejections, generic apologies wrapped in corporate language. Positions filled, not the right fit, best of luck in your search. Each no chipped away at my determination a little more. The apartment felt smaller each day. The walls seemed to lean in closer, as if they were tired of watching me pace back and forth, stuck in the same cycle. The unopened bills stacked on the counter became harder to ignore. The red ink on the rent notice seemed to glare at me from across the room like a reminder I couldn't escape. And still, silence from my boyfriend. No calls, no check-ins, not even a simple text to ask how I was doing. The first few days, I told myself he was giving me space, that maybe he thought I needed time to figure things out on my own. But as the week dragged on, it became harder to believe that. The distance between us wasn't temporary. It was something deeper, something that had been there all along. A feature, not a flaw. I started to notice things I hadn't wanted to admit before. How often our conversations were about his life, his work, his worries. How rarely he asked about mine. How quickly he brushed aside my concerns with empty reassurances, as if kindness was something he reserved for things that didn't challenge his comfort zone. Financial struggles apparently didn't fit into that. The more I sat with that realization, the more frustrated I became. Not just at him, but at myself.